Monitoring your application's performance is a critical part to building and maintaining production-grade applications. In this video, I'm going to show you how to add Prometheus metrics to an Express API. So who is this video for? This video is for those who have heard of metrics are good, but are not sure why. For those that have heard of Prometheus, but not 100% sure what it is. For those building and maintaining REST APIs, but you can also add Prometheus metrics to any API, including GraphQL APIs. If you would like to see a video on adding Prometheus metrics to a GraphQL API, please let me know in the comment section below. And it's for those who want to impress their boss. When I used to manage a team, if someone came to me with some Prometheus metrics to add to our application, I'd be very impressed. So what will you learn? You'll learn how to add a Prometheus server to your application, and you'll learn how to gather default and custom metrics with Prometheus. So because Prometheus is a metrics tool, it's used to answer questions that you may have about your application. So the questions that we're going to be answering in this video are: what server resources are being used? How long does a REST endpoint take to respond? And how long does a database operation take to respond? And do I have any bottlenecks in my application? I'm going to figure this out by these two metrics here. So what does this tutorial not cover? We're not going to cover hosting Prometheus or configuring or hosting Grafana. And the reason I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial is because they are different topics and they're generally covered by your DevOps or SRE team. If you would like to see a video on these, please let me know in the comment section below. Before we get started, let's take a look at a little diagram. So we have our operating system here, and on our operating system, we have our application running. We're going to have our REST API, and we're going to build out a metrics server. And then Prometheus is going to scrape the endpoint that you provide with your metrics server. And then you'll want to visualize what Prometheus is stored with Grafana. So we're just going to cover this bit here, the metrics server, in this tutorial. So there's a repository here on Tom Does Tech, REST API tutorial updated. If you'd like to follow along, you can clone this tutorial. If you'd like to see the code written in this video, please go to this repository and I'll commit everything that I write. So we need to install two dependencies. So I'm going to type yarn add, and I'm going to add prom client. And this is what we're going to use to gather our metrics. And we're also going to install response time. And response time is going to be used as a Express middleware to gather the response time for each request. Because we're using TypeScript, I'm going to install the definitely typed package for response time. I'm going to type yarn add at types / response time with -d to store it as a development dependency. So I have MongoDB running, so I'm going to be able to start this server with yarn dev. And we have TS node watching the server here, and the app has started and we've connected to the database. Let's get started building the metrics server. Inside the util folder, I'm going to make a new file, and I'm just going to call this metrics.ts. I'm going to import Express from Express. I'm going to import the Prometheus client, and I'm just going to import it as client from client. And I'm going to say const app equals Express. And this is going to be a different instance of Express because we need to run our metric server on a different port. You don't have to run your metric server on a different port, but it's generally a good idea because you probably don't want to expose your metrics to the internet. At the company that I work at, we have our metrics only exposed inside the VPC, and then Prometheus is running inside the VPC, and it scrapes all of the data from all the endpoints that are all internal. So the data exposed by Prometheus is all protected. So I'm going to say export function start prom server. Actually, let's call this metric server. And I'm going to say app.listen, and I'm going to listen on port 9100. And then I'm going to have a callback here, and I'm just going to say log. I'm going to import my log from .logger.info and say metrics server started at HTTP localhost port 9100. So we need to add a single endpoint to this server, and that is so we can get our metrics. And we're going to provide this endpoint to Prometheus, and Prometheus is going to scrape this endpoint on a configurable interval. So usually about 15 or 5 seconds. I'm going to say app.get. I'm going to say /metrics. I'm going to give this an async callback with a request object and a response object. So we're just going to return res.send. And we need a way to send out our metrics here. So I'm going to say await client.register.metrics. So when you execute this function, you're going to expose all the metrics that Prometheus has gathered. And we want to set a header for this. So I'm going to set the header with res.set. I'm going to set a content type header. Say client.register.content type. So we're going to get the content type from this content type string. You could hard code it if you want, but I find this is a little bit nicer. So before we go any further, let's collect some default metrics. So when I say default metrics, this is going to be things like how much memory and CPU your server is using, as well as your event loop lag and all good stuff like that. And so if, for example, your memory started spiking and then continued to grow, you would know that you have a memory leak. And if you didn't have Prometheus monitoring your application would keep restarting and you wouldn't know why. So let's say const collect default metrics equals client.collect default metrics. And then we're just going to execute this function. Collect default metrics, and we're going to execute it. So the last thing to do before we look at what this endpoint exposes is to start our metrics server. Let's come over to app. We're going to import start metrics server from utils/metrics. And when we start our normal server, I'm just also going to start our metrics server. So you can see here, metrics server started at localhost port 9100. So I have a Postman collection here, and you'll be able to find this Postman collection inside of this repository in this Postman collection JSON. And we have a metrics endpoint here. So I'm going to say HTTP //localhost port 9100 /metrics. And we're just going to make a GET request to this endpoint. Let's send this off. Let's have a look at some of them here. So we can say process CPU seconds in total. We can see process start time in seconds, process resident memory bytes, some really good stuff that you'll be able to graph out in Grafana. So let's add a custom metric. So I've come over to the GitHub repository for this Prom client. You can see here that we can use it to create histograms, summaries, gauges, and counters. In this tutorial, I'm just going to show you how to make histograms. And the reason for that is because most of your metrics that you're going to capture is going to be in a histogram. And if you're unfamiliar with what a histogram is, it's just going to be a distribution of numbers. So if we come down to the histogram documentation, you can see here that we have buckets. So we have 0.1, 5, 15, 50, and all your data is going to fit into these defined buckets. I tend to not define these buckets. I let Prom client create the buckets for me, and it generally does a pretty good job of that. So when we create a histogram, it's going to look a lot like this one here without the buckets defined. Let's come back to our application, and I'm going to define 2 histograms. So I'm going to say const rest response time histogram is equal to new client dot histogram. I'm going to give it a name, and the name is going to be snake case. So I'm going to say rest response time duration seconds. And it's pretty standard to capture your response time in seconds. So I'm just going to add some help text here. And the help text is going to appear here. So I say REST API response time in seconds. So the labels that I'm going to give it are going to be an array of strings, and I'm going to say method. So this is going to be like get, post, delete, the route, and this is going to be the route that is in our route file. And then I'm going to say status code. And this is going to be the status code, such as 200, 404, 500, etc. I'm going to spell histogram correctly. I'm going to create one more histogram. I say const database response time histogram equals new client dot histogram. I'm just going to copy the contents of this actually. Then I'm going to change this to DB for database. And I'm going to change this to database response time in seconds. And we're only going to have two properties here. We're going to have operation and we're going to have success. So success is just going to be a string that is either true or false. So let's go build out the function that's going to handle the REST response time. So if we come back into app.ts, we're going to build some middleware here that measures the response time and pipes it into that histogram. So I'm going to import response time from response time. Then I'm going to say app.use response time. And response time is going to take some arguments. And the first argument is a callback. And the callback has three arguments: the request object, response object, and the time that it took to resolve this request. So let's type this request, type the response, and the time is just going to be a number. Make sure we've imported request and response from Express. So let's add a condition here to be type save. So I'm going to say if rec dot route dot path, then we're safe to continue. Let's say rest response, and I think I need to export these to histograms. Quickly do that. Now we can say rest response time histogram dot observe. And there's a couple of different ways to use histograms, and I'm going to show you two ways to use it. So we're going to use observe here, and we're going to use a timer when we measure the database response time. So I'm going to give this a few properties here, and these properties are going to match these label names here. So I'm going to do method, route, and status code. There's a method of request.method, a route of request.route.path. And this is why we've checked that the path does actually exist on the request. And we're going to have a status code of res.status code. The final argument is going to be the time. So the time is in milliseconds, but our histogram here is in seconds. So to convert milliseconds to seconds, we're just going to times time by 1000. Let's come back over to our Postman collection, and I'm just going to send some requests to our application. Send this request to create a user, get an error here, create a session, get some sessions. I'm going to create a product, get a product, and then we can come back over to metrics and we can send this request. And you can see here that we have REST response time duration, and we have all of the routes that we hit. So we have /API users, and we got a status code of 409. We hit API sessions with a post request, and we got some status code 200s. And we got a few 403 errors here as well. A few people have asked me as well when they create a session, why the access token isn't being stored. So you can see when I created this session before, the access token wasn't restored, and that's why we got the 403s when we created a product. The reason for that is because you have no environment selected. So come up to here and select your environment. And then when I click send on create session, it's going to store an access token. So I can click the little I here, and I can see that it's stored my access and refresh token. So let's move on to recording the response time for database operations. So I'm going to come over to our services, and I'm going to come into product service. So when we create a product, I want to be able to start a timer before we create the product. And then I want to end the timer when the product is created. So let's say const metrics labels is going to be an object. And I'm going to give this one property for now. It's going to be operation. And that operation I'm just going to get from the function name. And then I'm going to say const timer is equal to database response time histogram. I'll let VS Code import that for me. Dot start timer. And I'm going to execute that function. So we need to change this to an async await function. So I'm going to say const result equals await. Then I'm going to return result, but we have a success property on our metric here. So we need to know if this operation here fails. Let's wrap this in a try catch block. I'm going to move this up here to return result. Otherwise, I'm going to catch the error. And you should handle this error in an appropriate way. I'm just going to throw it. And so if the promise here resolves, I'm going to say timer, and I'm going to execute our timer. I'm going to spread the metrics labels. And I'm going to say success is true. Otherwise, success is going to be false. Let's come back over to Postman and let's send this request again. And you'll notice that all of the metrics that we captured before have disappeared. And the reason for that is because Prom Client is just going to store these in memory. And so once your application shuts down, they're going to be lost. That's why you scrape it every 5 or 15 seconds. So let's log out. And then we're going to try create a product. And you can see we got a forbidden error. Let's try gather our metrics again. So you can see here we have our REST response time and we have a status code of 403, but we have nothing in the database collection here. And the reason for that is because we have some middleware that says you're required to be logged in to create a product. So let's try log in again. Logged in here. We're going to create a product. We're going to get a 200 response this time. You can see here that we have our 403 still, but now we have some 200s for creating a product, and we have some database response time operations. And you can see that one request fell into all of these buckets. So let's add this timer to one more request, and we can remove this return down here because it's never going to get called. I'm going to add this to find product. So I'm going to await find product. I'm going to try it. And then I'm going to catch. And to move this into a try catch box and say const result equals, then I'm going to return the result. I'm going to create a timer. I'm going to say that this is successful, but down here, this is not going to be successful. Then I'm just going to throw this error as well. But we need to change the operation here from create product to find product. Let's go back to Postman. I'm going to send a bunch of requests to find the product. Let's go to get our metrics. And we can see database response time. So we have a few requests that fell into this bucket, 2 that fell into this bucket here, and a bunch that fell into these buckets. And we have a bunch of successful requests. So that is how to add Prometheus to your Express REST API. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.